Kristen Atchison here. We're still talking about Chapter 11, Perceiving Speech and Music. And yay, we're still talking about perceiving speech. This is our third lecture where we're going to talk about speech perception on a more neural level. So what's really interesting about neural level processing is that our perceptual system tunes itself to its environment. We call this perceptual narrowing. Now this happens in a number of different areas of perception. It can happen in vision, but we're going to really focus in on it here in terms of speech because we have some really good examples to show you. So again, we talked about this already, that at birth, infants can really distinguish between phonemes in any language. They can tell the difference between these phonemes, they're born with this. This is an innate ability. So they really are universal listeners, and they really have that capacity up until about 6 months of age. Then, kind of through experience, through birth through 6 months, and continued experience after 6 months, the perceptual system really starts to narrow. So at about 6 months, it says, okay, well, if I'm not using all of these phonemes, why am I dedicating brain power to it? Now, obviously, this is not happening on a conscious level, but this is what's going on. So the experience narrows to the speech sounds that are present in that environment. Now, again, this is not just the auditory system. We see this in terms of face processing as well. And there's some really great, interesting literature about that. But let's talk about it in terms of phonemes. So how does this narrowing occur? We talk about it in terms of undevelopment of the brain, where neurons are being eliminated. Certain neurons will die because they're not being used. We'll also see this in terms of synaptic pruning. So remember, synapses are those connections between neurons. If those connections are not being used, that connection will die too. You can see it really well in this image here. So this is brain development from basically almost conception, basically when we start having a brain prenatally through death. Okay, so this is really a lifespan here. And the green line has both the auditory and the visual areas of the cerebral cortex. Now what you see, that green line goes up after birth, and it really peaks at about 4 to 6 months, somewhere in there. And again, part of that peaking there is because it's, again, combining both visual and auditory areas. After that, we see that line start to go down. That line starting to go down is that synaptic pruning, okay? So we see more connections than we need being made early on in infancy, and later, the ones that aren't being used are being pruned away, taken away. So again, think of pruning as, your bush, right? You're pruning a bush, and when somebody prunes a bush in their yard, they cut back the bush. They cut back the parts of the bush that they don't need. That's what's happening in terms of our synapses, in terms of our brain connections. So let's watch a video that kind of shows this to some extent. So we have these critical periods where this perceptual narrowing happens. So remember I said we're universal listeners up until about 6 months of age. That's because at about 6 months of age, we're going to really start pruning that information that's not being used. What's interesting, however, is even if that information hasn't been used up until this critical period, if the information starts being used, it won't be pruned away. So here's an example of that in terms of phonemes and in terms of language with infants.
Happens if they are exposed to a second language during this period. That's what researchers in Pat Kuhl's lab tried to answer. Infants between the ages of 9 and 10 months are brought to the lab for a series of 12 sessions during which they are exposed to games and stories in Mandarin. Even though Mandarin is not a language 9-month Delaney is used to hearing, she is all attention, enjoying the story that Dr. Hui Mei Liu is reading. After the 12 sessions of exposure, she will be brought back for testing to see if she's absorbed any Mandarin. 9-and-a-half-month-old Matthew has completed the 12 sessions and is back for the test. He is dressed in a cap with electrodes hooked up to a computer. It will record the electrical activity in his brain in response to the sounds he hears.
What's that noise? What is that noise?
As the test begins, Matthew's attention is held by a researcher's visual entertainment so that he remains absolutely still. On a loudspeaker, two sounds are repeated. They represent two different words in Mandarin Chinese. An adult who hasn't grown up speaking Mandarin can't hear the difference between the two sounds. But Matthew has been exposed to Mandarin during the sensitive period, when most children's brains are beginning to filter out sounds that are not part of his native tongue. When his brain activity is reviewed on the computer, the two lines on the graph clearly show that he is discriminating between the two Mandarin sounds. The results of the study suggest that a child brought up with more than one language can learn the sounds of both languages. But it's the capacity to reproduce sounds that fuels the next stage of the journey towards speech.
So you saw in that video kind of having that experience with Mandarin Chinese, even though this was not something that these children had been experienced previously, kind of in this critical period kept that perceptual narrowing from happening. And we were again seeing this represented in activity in the brain, that the brain was able to distinguish between these phonemes, which if you're not familiar with Mandarin Chinese, you won't be able to distinguish between them. But again, these children have been, and so they were able to do that. So another video that really looks at kind of how the perceptual system tunes itself and how the brain kind of develops based on this perceptual input is really shown here in this EEG study by Neville. It's got both Al and Alda, an adult and a child, and it shows kind of the differences in both speed of processing and area of processing different parts of speech.
The video's narration sometimes makes sense.
A baby penguin swings on that door. The baby
And sometimes it doesn't.
The truck goes up and down in the papers over hills.
The electrodes are recording where and when my brain reacts to these mistakes. When the mistake is simply a word that doesn't make sense,
Pinga turns up the penguin really loud.
an area in the back of my brain, mostly on the left, reacts within 0.2 of a second. But when the mistake is grammatical,
The concert are starting.
my brain pounces on the error within 1/10 of a second, and this time in a region toward the front and exclusively on the left. Following me into the video booth and equipped with a much more fetching hat is 6-year-old
Pinga throws
Danica.
wood into that black stove.
When there's a mistake of meaning,
Pinga claps her ball happily.
her brain, just like mine, reacts in 0.2 of a second. But when the video says something grammatically incorrect,
The pancake falls onto his head. Pingu
her
has
brain
an
is
elephant's
slower to
nose on
respond than
his
mine.
face.
And the response isn't so focused over that area in the front left. In fact, Helen Neville argues, it takes perhaps 10 or 15 years for the brain to organize itself to process grammar swiftly and efficiently in just one focused, specialized region.
Looks, for example, like that's an important area for sequencing different kinds of information, and of course sequencing is an important part of language. Looks like areas just behind there are very important for tool use, in the left side as well.
Tool use.
Tool use, yeah.
Tool use over where language is taking.
Actually, it's possible that one aspect of language is closely tied to tool use, especially this kind of action planning and sequencing that we have to do in order to talk.
So you saw in the EEG CAP studies that the area that was being activated was very different in the adult brain than it was the younger brain. And again, this is evidence of that continued perceptual narrowing and focusing in based on our experiences. Now, to kind of our general brain perception of speech, just like we had in just regular sounds and in terms of vision, we still have ventral and dorsal pathways. Remember, dorsal, like dorsal fin, that's going across the top. Ventral is going to be the underside. And the ventral stream in this image is red. And we'll see that that really is kind of going between the occipital lobe and areas in the temporal lobe. And we're going to see that it's also going between hemispheres too. So we're going to see that this is going to both the left and the right hemisphere, where the dorsal pathway really functions in this left hemisphere, where we see different areas of the brain that are really specific to speech processing. So our auditory cortex activity doesn't tell the difference. So it doesn't show different activity, but whether it's speech or non-speech. Sound is sound is sound is sound to the auditory cortex. Its activity doesn't change. However, the higher functioning areas do. And again, that ventral pathway is going to represent the meaning of words. So that stuff that's going between the left and the right hemisphere is going to be representing that meaning of words. And this is really similar to the what pathway that we've talked about before. Whereas the dorsal pathway, again, that's going to be more towards the top, is going to be related to the production of speech. This is going to be where that where and how are. In that dorsal area are Wernicke's areas and Broca's areas. And again, these are both in that left hemisphere. They're part of this dorsal pathway. We'll see that Broca's area is mostly involved in production, whereas Wernicke's area is largely involved in comprehension. And we'll see when there's damage to these areas that we'll see different kinds of loss of function. So again, Broca's areas and Wernicke's areas, these are really important, and we've been learning about these since intro psychology, because these were some of the first areas to show us how brain damage can really selectively affect cognition. We talked about these already some when we talked about kind of the functional areas of the brain, that there are functional areas of the brain, and how these lesion studies really gave us that information, and how deficits really gave us this information. So these were some of the first areas, and they're named after the people that found them, Broca and Wernicke. This really provides evidence for, again, the existence of brain regions that are very functionally specific to comprehension and production. And brain damage to these areas leads to aphasias. Aphasias is what we're going to call those deficits in speech, either function, whether it's in terms of comprehension or production. So Broca's aphasia is also called expressive aphasia because it has problems of expression. So there's a YouTube video that you can watch that's linked in the lecture outline that really shows this. It's kind of long. You do not need to watch all 7 minutes of it, but you can see that this 19-year-old has problems answering questions, expressing herself. Sometimes she tries to write it down because she's having problems with the speech production. Right? She can write it down though. So this is telling you that this really is about speech production. Where Wernicke's aphasia is also called fluent aphasia because it has problems with fluency. And again, there's a video here. He'll be asked questions and he won't understand them and they has to be repeated many times. And when he produces speech, it's very, very confusing too. Rarely does it sound very intelligible. So again, both of these are examples of how these functional areas, when they're damaged, that we really can see deficits in these areas that are related to the function of the area. Okay, that ends our conversation about speech perception. On to music. Thanks.